David and Marissa's 40-year marriage in New York seemed unshakable, but behind the walls of their apartment brewed a storm of resentment. When the truth about unfulfilled dreams and Marissa S.'s inability to bear children collided with decades of hidden bitterness, love turned into lethal rage. What began as a lifelong partnership ended in blood, betrayal, and a shocking murder that left their community reeling. David and Marissa's life together began in the late 1970s, a time when the world was far less forgiving than it is today. They met in a small cafe in Brooklyn, both drawn to each other by quiet glances and a shared sense of longing for connection. Marissa, a transgender woman, carried with her the weight of being judged and misunderstood by much of society. Yet with David, she found acceptance, or at least what seemed to be acceptance. He admired her strength and her charm, and she admired his determination to see beyond the surface. Their bond quickly deepened, and within a few years they married in act of defiance against a world that did not always understand them. For 4 decades they built a life side by side, weathering storms and celebrating victories that only strengthened their commitment. Their early years were filled with modest dreams. They bought a small apartment in Queens, which they turned into a warm home, decorated with personal touches that reflected Marissa's flair for style. David worked steady hours at a local hardware store, while Marissa found her joy in teaching part-time at a community center. Together, they built routines that spoke of comfort and trust. They cooked meals side by side, spent weekends at the park, and leaned on one another during times when the outside world seemed harsh. To many who knew them, they were an unshakable pair, proof that love could endure despite adversity. But beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary marriage lay a quiet tension that never completely faded. From the start, David had expressed his desire for a family, for children who would carry on his name and fill their home with noise and laughter. Marissa, though deeply in love, knew this was something she could never give him. She carried that truth like a shadow, hoping her affection and devotion would be enough to fill the absence. For years, David reassured her that love mattered more than children, and she clung to his words, believing that what they shared could withstand any disappointment. As the decades passed, their lives became steady, almost routine. They traveled occasionally, celebrated anniversaries with small dinners, and grew older together in the same home they had cherished since their youth. Yet the subject of children lingered in the background like an unspoken wound. Family gatherings reminded David of what he lacked, as nieces, nephews, and neighbors' children surrounded him with reminders of a future he would never experience. He smiled through the moments, but inside, resentment began to take root. For Marissa, the guilt was constant. She noticed the way his eyes softened when he watched families in the park, the way his smile faltered at birthdays where little ones played. She wished she could change the reality, but all she could do was love him fiercely, hoping it would be enough. In her heart, she feared it wasn't. Still, she believed their decades together proved the strength of their bond. From the outside, David and Marissa were the picture of endurance, a couple who had conquered judgment and time. But within the walls of their quiet Queens apartment, cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that would one day split open and reveal the darkness hiding beneath the surface. As the years moved forward, the silence between David and Marissa grew heavier. In their 40s, the absence of children was still something they could brush aside, excusing it with busy schedules or the belief that their lives were fulfilling in other ways. But by the time they reached their 60s, the difference between them and those around them became impossible to ignore. Family gatherings were filled with grandchildren, tugging at their grandparents' sleeves, laughter echoing through rooms that David found both joyful and suffocating. He would smile politely, but behind the smile was an ache he could not hide. Marissa watched him closely, sensing his disappointment, and felt a crushing weight of guilt. David became quieter at social events, retreating into himself when conversations turned to family legacies. His brothers and sisters spoke proudly of their children's achievements, of graduations and weddings, while David contributed little. He often sat in silence, his mind elsewhere, his face betraying envy and longing. Marissa, sitting beside him, felt the sting of judgment, not only from relatives, but from her own conscience. She knew he was thinking about the life he had wanted, the one she could never provide. At home, the tension sharpened. Our Queen's apartment, once filled with warmth, felt colder. Small disagreements about chores or money turned into deeper conflicts. with David's frustration often circling back to the emptiness he felt. He began spending more time away from Marissa, lingering at bars after work or wandering the neighborhood late at night. Marissa noticed the smell of alcohol on his breath, the distant look in his eyes, and she realized their bond was unraveling. For Marissa, the pain was layered. Not only did she fear losing the man she had shared her life with, but she also wrestled with her own feelings of inadequacy. She had survived decades of prejudice from the outside world, believing her marriage was proof that she could be loved fully. Now, as David grew more bitter, she wondered if the love had only been conditional. If 40 years of loyalty and devotion were not enough to fill the void left by the absence of children, David's bitterness seeped into everyday moments. When he saw fathers playing with their children on the street, his jaw tightened. When neighbors spoke of their grandchildren, his replies grew curt. At night, he stared at the ceiling instead of speaking to Marissa, lost in thoughts that darkened with each passing year. He did not lash out openly at first, but his silence was sharp, cutting deeper than words. Marissa tried to bridge the distance, suggesting trips, shared hobbies, or new projects. She hoped distraction might soften his dissatisfaction. Yet, her efforts only seemed to irritate him further. As if every attempt to redirect his focus was a reminder of what was missing. The gap between them widened until it felt like they were living separate lives under the same roof. By their 70th year, the resentment was no longer hidden. David's disappointment had transformed into anger, simmering just below the surface. Marissa felt it in the way he looked at her, in the way his words grew sharper, and in the way his presence became more threatening. What had once been a partnership built on love and endurance was slipping into something darker, a slow descent that neither of them could stop. The slow unraveling of their marriage reached a dangerous stage when David's bitterness turned into open hostility. What had once been subtle distance now showed itself in sharp words and cold stares that left Marissa shaken. She noticed the change in his routines first. He stayed out longer, returning home with the smell of whiskey heavy on his clothes, his footsteps unsteady, and his temper short. When she tried to ask where he had been, he brushed her off with irritation, as though her concern was an intrusion. The man who had once been her protector now seemed like a stranger, his warmth replaced with unpredictable mood swings. Marissa felt increasingly isolated inside her own home. The apartment, filled with reminders of their 40 years together, no longer felt safe. There are photographs on the walls, from vacations, anniversaries, and ordinary days mocked her as she listened to David slam doors or mutter under his breath. She tried to hold on to hope, convincing herself that age, stress, or alcohol were fueling his cruelty. Yet deep inside, she sensed something irreversible had shifted. The love she once relied on had hardened into resentment. Neighbors began to notice. Once, David and Marissa had been known as the couple who always greeted others with kindness, often sitting together on their stoop during summer evenings. Now Marissa was seen alone, her shoulders slumped, her expressions clouded with worry. David walked ahead of her without speaking, his hands clenched in his pockets, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Gossip spread quietly through the building, whispers of arguments overheard through thin walls, voices raised in anger that carried down the hallways. Marissa's fear deepened when David's hostility became physical in subtle ways, no longer touched her with affection. Instead, his gestures carried an edge of menace, a slammed fist on the table during an argument, a shove past her in the narrow kitchen, a grip on her arm that lingered too long. None of it left visible marks, but each moment carved into her sense of safety. She began moving more carefully around him, choosing her words with caution, hoping to avoid sparking his rage. At night, she lay awake, listening to the sound of his breathing beside her, wondering how the man she had trusted with her life could become her greatest source of dread. The thought of leaving crossed her mind, but after 4 decades together, walking away felt impossible. She had no children to lean on, no immediate family who could provide refuge. Her entire world had been built around David, and now that world had turned against her. David, consumed by his obsession with what he had been denied, no longer saw Marissa as the woman he had once loved. Instead, she became a symbol of his disappointments, a reminder of the children he would never have and the legacy he felt had been stolen from him. His anger, once buried, had grown into something dangerous, feeding off itself until it demanded release. Marissa sensed it coming. She felt it in the tension that lingered in the air, in the way David's eyes lingered on her with something colder than hatred. The man she had shared her life with for 40 years was no longer just bitter, he was dangerous. And she feared that the resentment he carried would soon erupt into something she might not survive. The night of the crime began like so many others, with silence so heavy it felt like a presence in the room. David had been drinking again, his glass of whiskey clinking against the table as he sat in his chair, staring into nothing. Marissa moved quietly through the apartment, her footsteps soft, her breathing shallow, though trying not to disturb a dangerous animal. Tension between them had built for weeks, each day marked by sharper words, colder stares, and a growing sense of dread. That evening, the fragile balance shattered. It started with David muttering under his breath, words Marissa could barely make out. When she asked him to repeat himself, he snapped, his voice rising in anger. He spoke of the children he had wanted, the life he believed she had stolen from him, and the decades of disappointment he claimed he had endured. His face twisted with bitterness as he accused her of being the reason his life felt incomplete. Marissa, trembling, tried to remind him of their 40 years together, of the sacrifices they had both made, and the love that had once defined their marriage. But her words, instead of calming him, only fueled his fury. David rose from his chair, his movements unsteady but filled with menace. He advanced on her, shouting louder now, his anger spilling over. Marissa backed into the kitchen, her heart pounding as she tried to keep distance between them. The argument escalated into a storm of rage, decades of suppressed resentment crashing out all at once. She saw his eyes, not filled with the man she once knew, but with a stranger consumed by hatred. In that moment, David reached for the knife left on the counter from dinner. The sight of it in his hand froze Marissa where she stood. She pleaded, her voice breaking, but her words fell into the void between them. In a blur of rage, David lunged. The blade struck, and the violence was sudden, brutal, and final. Marissa collapsed to the floor, the light in her eyes fading as the life they had built together dissolved in an instant. The apartment was filled with silence once more, but now it was the silence of death. David stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands shaking as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The anger that had fueled him drained away, leaving only shock and emptiness. Blood pooled on the floor, staining the tiles of the home that had once been their sanctuary. The photographs on the wall, frozen reminders of happier times, seemed to watch as the love story they had captured ended in horror. For a long moment, David did not move. He stared at the knife, at Marissa's still body, unable to reconcile the decades they had shared with the final act of violence he had committed. The man who had once sworn to love and protect her had become the one to destroy her. The home they had built was now a crime scene, and their marriage, which had endured 40 years, had come to its end in the most brutal way imaginable. The aftermath of the crime was as chilling as the act itself. When neighbors heard shouting, followed by sudden silence, a sense of unease spread through the building. Hours later, when no one had seen Marissa, whispers began to circulate in the hallway. The couple had always been private, but the tension that had been noticed in recent months now seemed to have reached a breaking point. It was the building superintendent who eventually knocked on the apartment door, concerned by the stillness inside. David answered, pale and trembling, claiming Marissa had gone to bed early. His voice was flat, his eyes distant. The excuse did little to ease suspicion. By the next morning, the truth could no longer be concealed. The superintendent, acting on instinct, contacted authorities to request a wellness check. When police entered the apartment, the scene that greeted them was grim. Marissa lay lifeless on the kitchen floor, her body showing clear signs of violence. The knife, stained and abandoned, sat nearby. The photographs on the wall and the neatness of the room only made the brutality more shocking. David was still in the apartment, slumped in a chair, his face expressionless. He offered no resistance as officers handcuffed him, his silence speaking louder than words. The investigation revealed a story that horrified the community. Detectives pieced together the years of strain, the growing resentment over the absence of children, and the escalation of hostility in the final months. Neighbors provided accounts of arguments heard through thin walls, of Marissa's worried demeanor, and of David's increasing reliance on alcohol. Every detail painted a picture of a marriage once held together by love, but undone by bitterness and obsession. News of the murder spread quickly across New York, shocking those who had admired the couple's endurance. Too many they had seemed unbreakable, a pair who had withstood decades of judgment and hardship. The revelation that their bond had ended in such violence left friends and acquaintances shaken. Marissa's identity as a transgender woman brought further discussion, highlighting the struggles she had faced, and the tragic irony that her greatest battle had not come from strangers, but from the man she trusted most. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence in meticulous detail. The knife, the bloodstains, the accounts of neighbors, and the history of arguments made a compelling case. David's defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming his age and mental state had clouded his judgment, but the jury saw through the claims. 40 years of marriage, they determined, did not excuse the act of brutality that ended Marissa's life. The verdict was guilty, and David was sentenced to spend his remaining years behind prison walls. His freedom stripped as permanently as Marissa's life had been. In the courtroom, Marissa's memory was honored by those who spoke of her kindness, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. Her story became both a tragedy and a cautionary tale, a reminder that even relationships, built over decades, can harbor dangerous fractures. Love, when poisoned by resentment, can transform into something lethal. The life Marissa had fought to build ended not with peace, but with betrayal, leaving behind a story of devotion turned into devastation, and a haunting legacy that would not soon be forgotten.